Hello everyone, and welcome to part 3 of the web design intro. And you're going to go ahead and, as usual, log into Replit and navigate to assignment 1. We're still working from that same assignment. If you need a reminder of how to log in, you can go to repl.it, hit on the login button, go to the Google G to log in with your Wheeler login information. Once you get to a new Replit page, it'll look something like this. You can hit the arrow next to your name and then click on Student, and you should see your classroom pop up right here. Then click on Assignments, and it should take you to your assignment. So remember, we're still working from assignment 1. So you should have gone through lessons 1 and 2, so we can scroll down. There's lesson 2, and here is lesson 3. This has just been added. So the goal of this lesson is to continue learning how to use CSS tools to stylize your page. So last week we kind of learned the basics, right? Like what CSS is, how to do some kind of basic things, changing colors, all of that kind of stuff. And today we're going to be learning a little bit more of the finer details of how to do this. So we have a bunch of terms here. We're going to be going through those as we go, so I'm not going to go through them all at the beginning, but they're here if you need a refresher, if you need to scroll up and check those. So we'll skip right on down to our programming to try. And the first thing we're going to do is use something called an ID. So an ID selector is basically a way in CSS of referring to a single specific element on your page by name, so that you can apply CSS to just that one item. So we saw that, like right here, I can set the style of this inline in my HTML to whatever color I want. This, using an ID, is a way of kind of doing that without having to get into the HTML. It's a way of selecting exactly one item, one specific item, using the CSS over in this other document. So it's a useful tool to have, so you're not mixing up your CSS and HTML more than you want to. And it's also fun because it lets you name things. So we'll start by going into our HTML to give a name to this item. This is also useful if you end up adding a bunch of specific styles to this one line of code, because if you tried to put a bunch of style lines in here, this would end up getting really long and clunky. Okay, so we'll say ID equals, and I'm going to give it the ID name title 1. Notice that there are quotation marks around the word title 1. So there's my name. If I run this, nothing should happen and my code should look pretty much the same, or really exactly the same. Okay, so now I have this ID set. So the next thing we're going to do is move over to our CSS document, and then I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom to make a new rule. You could also add this at the top if you wanted to. And so far we have been using tags. We've been referring to tags in our HTML. So we have the A tag, the image tag, the LI tag. In this case, I need to tell the computer that this is not a tag. This is an ID. And the way I do that is by putting a hashtag in front and then just giving the name of the ID that I'm using. And then I can put my open and close curly braces to start writing my new rule. And in this rule, I'm going to set my background color to black. Now, if you remember, up here we said that we want all of our H1s and H2s to have a background color of pink. But now I've said, well, actually, that H1, title 1, I want that to have a background color of black. And because this is more specific, this is an ID, this is something that has priority, and so it kind of wins over our more general tag rule. So I will end up seeing a black background. Hopefully that makes sense. You can do as many IDs as you want. The next thing we're going to talk about, though, is class. So you don't want to use the same ID for multiple elements. So, for example, if I came over here, I wouldn't want to put both of these paragraphs as having the ID paragraph. What I would use instead is called a class. So that's number 2. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just like I did for my ID, I'm going to say class instead of ID, obviously. And then I'm going to give it the ID about text. So this is the text that is in my about section. And I am going to give both of these paragraphs the class about text. Remember, I wouldn't want to do that with an ID because an ID is just for one element. Okay, so now these are both in the class of about text. They're both in the group about text. So again, if I hit run with just that change, nothing should happen. But I can go over to my index.css file and I can make a rule that's specifically for the items that are in that class. And the way that I tell this, hey, this isn't an ID, this isn't an HTML tag, is by using the period. So I say period, and then I put the name, which is about text, of my class. All right, now here I want to change the font color to orange. Now remember that I have more than just these 2 paragraphs. I have this paragraph here, but this is also a paragraph. Now when I press run, what do you expect to happen? Hopefully you said that just these 2 lines would end up with orange text, and let's run it and see. Okay, so because these 2 paragraphs, if you come back here, right, these are our 2 paragraphs that are in the about text class. So they have their font changed to orange, but this paragraph down here, it's not part of the class, and so it doesn't change colors. If I wanted to, I could add it to that, and then they would all be orange, but then there would be no point because then I could just change the color to orange for my entire set of paragraphs. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, the next question is, how do we think that... So the next question is, how do you think the ID and the class relate to one another? So, for example, what do you think would happen if I added an ID to one of the paragraphs in my about text class that changed the font color to something else? Do you think it would change colors, or do you think it would stay orange? Let's try it. So let's say I give this second paragraph the ID of, I'm just going to call it para. I'm not feeling very creative here. And then I'll go over here and I'll say, okay, for para, I want my font color to be green. And you can see that, again, because this is more specific, an ID is more specific than a class, it does turn green. And that's really important to kind of understand the priority of how things work in CSS. It's that cascading part of the cascading style sheets that we talked about last time. All right. So now let's move on to the box model. This is a really important idea in CSS, just like the cascading is a really important idea in CSS. So here is a visual of our box model, courtesy of W3 Schools. And you can see that basically HTML elements are just kind of a bunch of boxes. So if I have some content, right, some HTML tag, a paragraph, an image, that's in the center of our content, of our box model. And then just around that is our padding, and then around that is our border, and then around that is our margin. It's kind of like a bunch of nesting boxes. And this is a really important thing to understand, because being able to control all of these different aspects of our content allows us to make our page look the way that we want it to. So let's start by going back to our title and putting some padding on it. So in my title ID, I am going to add padding, and I'm going to set this to 50px. So px stands for pixels. There are other ways of setting this. You could set it to a percentage. Like there's a couple different ways of measuring, but for right now, we're going to stick with pixels. So I'm going to make my padding 50 pixels. Now, if we look at our box model, what I should expect to happen is that there's some space like just around my content. So this is what it looks like right now. I'm going to hit run. And now you can see that my background, it looks like it's just expanded a lot. So that is the padding. The space around my content is kind of getting bigger. All right, so hopefully padding makes some sense. And the next thing we want to add is a border. Now, with a border, we have to say not only how big we want our border to be, but what color and what style we want it to be. So I'm going to make this a 15 pixel wide border that is solid and blue. So this is my width, this is my type, and this is my color. I could set this, there's a bunch of different options for what I can set my style to, and there is a link right here to different ways to change your borders. So let's see what that looks like. All right, so now we can see this 15 pixel border. And we notice that it is outside of our padding, just like it is in our box model here. And finally, we want to add some margin. So this is essentially white space that's going to be around our item. It's empty space. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll make our margin 50 pixels. And watch what happens. Remember, notice the white space here, what we have currently. And then now I have a lot more in all directions. So it's really worth noting kind of how that changes things. So if we were, for example, to set it to 0, you see how it touches all of the edges? And the reason is because all of these numbers right now, the way we're using them, it's adding 50 pixels on all sides. And it's the same thing for like our border. There's 15 pixel border on all sides. Now, hopefully you remember that in our first week, we actually already did a little bit with width and height, and we're going to bring that back. So if we go into our index.html file, we can see here where we did, for our image, we did style, width is 50%, and height is 50%. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to practice with width and height again, but this time in our index.css file. So let's run over to our title. I'm going to go back again into this ID rule, and we're going to add a width of, I don't know, let's see, 300 pixels, and see what changes. So you'll notice that it has shrunken down to a smaller width. The box around our content has gotten smaller. Now, if I made this something like 50 pixels, we would have the interesting results of getting things that overrun the edge, and the different words would become lines. So you want to be careful for that kind of thing. But if I set it to 300, it's all nicely on one line. It's not quite even, but there are other ways to deal with that. Right now we're just practicing the basics. And then we can also add a height. So I can set that to something like 50 pixels. Now that looks pretty similar to what I had before. If I want, I can make it really tall, make it like 100 pixels. But width and height are pretty self-explanatory, and you can use other methods of defining width and height, like percentage, like we used last time. Now, as a little bit of practice, let's make a new ID for Title 2 and practice changing width and height there. So in order to do that, we'll go over to index.html and then add ID equals title 2 to give it a name. Then come back into our CSS document and say title 2, and we can say width of, I don't know, like 50 pixels. Oh no, that's going to be way too small. 100 pixels. And then let's give it a height of 25 pixels. So go ahead and play with those a little bit. Maybe think about adding some borders or paddings or margin to some of the other items on the page. So an important thing to understand is what inline and block elements are. So if we scroll back up here, under our terms, we have definitions. So an inline is an element that starts on the same line as the previous element. An example of this is something like bold. So if we look over here, or in this case it's actually italic that I have in here, I have this line, this bit of HTML, but it's in line with the rest of my HTML. It doesn't create a new line. Favorite doesn't show up on a new line. It continues in the same line. So this is what an inline item does. A block element is something like our bullet points here, which each start on a new line. So the next thing we're going to talk about is display. So this is another really important CSS property, and it is one that is super useful. The list of things that it does might seem a little bit odd at first. So you can use it to hide an element that you don't want seen for some reason. You can use it to make things appear on the same line when they would normally appear on different lines, and you can use it to make things appear on a new line when they would normally appear on separate ones. So let's try this, because I think this is one of the ones that's definitely easier to see than to hear about. So we'll start here with setting our title display to none. So what this is going to do is going to make our title actually disappear. So if I go display none, and then I hit run, it just doesn't show up at all. So this is a useful tool because sometimes you want something to disappear, and there are other ways, like using JavaScript, that you can make something disappear and reappear by changing the display value. Now I'm going to take this out because I think that a title is a useful thing to have, and I don't want to just completely disappear it. All right, so the next thing we're going to try is list item. So right here under list item, I am going to make this a little bit different than it is right now. So if we come down here, we can notice that each of our list items is on a new line. What this means is that they are working as block elements, elements that show up on a new line below the previous line of HTML, right? So right here, we have our list item, and the next list item below it, it goes on a new line. Okay, so all of these are on new lines. And what I want to do is under list item, I'm going to change my display to inline. And now all of my list items are right next to each other. They're all on the same line rather than on a new line. Again, this isn't necessarily something I want to keep, so I'm going to get rid of that. Finally, you'll remember, hopefully, that my link right here is right next to my image. If I could look at my HTML, I have the A tag here, but the image tag shows up on the same line as my A tag. And what I want to happen, what I think would look better, is if the image was on a new line. So what I can do is change this, this image tag from an inline element to a block element by coming over here, and I'll go into image and I'll set it to display block. And now it's right underneath, and it looks a lot better. So go ahead and play around with this, try to customize your website, add some more detail, add some more content, and I'm excited to show you even more next time. Bye!